וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, פנחס בן אלעזר בן אהרון הכהן, השיב אס חמוסי מעל בני ישראל, בקנאו אס קנאוסי בסוכם, ולא חליסי אס בני ישראל בקנאוסי.
Our Torah portion is called Pinchas, and it starts with the book of Numbers, chapter 25, with verse 11. Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, had turned away my wrath from the sons of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them. So I did not destroy the sons of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, behold, I give my covenant of peace. This Torah portion is also very important when we considering the character of God, particularly the issue of His justice and the treatment of people, because there is lots of bloodshed here. There's lots of harshness in these stories, and that's why, particularly in the 2nd century, one of the Christian heretics called Marcion has said that there are two different gods: the evil God of Israel of the Old Testament, and the good God of the New Testament, Jesus Christ. And the reason for this was that when he was reading the Torah, he saw lots of bloodshed, and comparison with the Sermon on the Mountain and other stories from the life of Jesus really led him to believe in a contrast. And that's why he actually suggested that dualism and approach to God from two different perspectives. In fact, it was two gods in his mind: the God of Israel, which was evil and harsh and severe, and in the God of the New Testament. So it is good opportunity for us to look and see what is really going on, without coming from the New Testament perspective with preconceived ideas, but looking from the perspective of the Torah and the story there. The story, of course, begins in the previous chapter, in the previous parasha, which is called Balak. And the story starts with the fact that the people of Israel now are ready to move into the land of Canaan. And they have an obstacle. They tried to use the shortest road, which is through the land of Edom. This road would go right now from Eilat and would move along the wadi through the southern tip of the Dead Sea, and turning and the west and bypassing the Dead Sea from the west side. That would be the shortest road to Jericho. The Jericho was the key strategic goal of the people of Israel. Of course, they had to go through the territory of Edom. And they were told that Edom is not their land. God has not given that land to them. They had no intention to express any aggression toward Edom. In fact, in the later parashot in the book of Deuteronomy, it says there that Edom is your brother and you should not despise him. So Moses addressed the Edom's kings And again, Edom wasn't a unified state. It had a number of city-states that had an alliance. And so he asked them, can we pass by? And actually, we have the money. We won't go through your field. We won't go through your pasture. Whatever we drink on your way, we will pay. And Edom said no. And brought the army and said, if you just attempt to cross our border, our army will attack you. That was a big problem. And so Israel had to use the other bypass, which would take them farther east, across the mountain range, which is right at the eastern edge of the Dead Sea. And they had to go from behind that mountain range and across the fields of Moab. And Moab is located basically on a plateau, which is right now the southern territory of Jordan. And so on that plateau, there are a number of settlements. They're discovered now, the cities of Moab. And it appears from the text that it was a coalition, not only of the Moabite cities, but the Midianite cities. So there is a joint coalition of Moabites and Midianites that are facing Israel that passes by them. And later on, in the book of Deuteronomy, in Parashat Dvarim and Vayetchanan, we will learn that it wasn't the purpose of God to give Moab to Israel. So they weren't supposed to fight there. But Moabites were afraid of them. And even though Moabites had a strategic advantage, because they were on a mountain top, they could defend and even attack Israel. Balak, the king of the Moabites, probably one of the kings of the cities that headed the Moabite Midianite coalition, was really afraid. And he decided to use a certain trick to help and to defend himself against Israel. Instead of trying to use military force against the Israelites, he decided to use the power of heaven against them. Particularly, he started to look for an individual who could be a prophet of God Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I specifically used that name because in the mind of Balak, Yahweh is one of the gods, and particularly God of Israel, who is really, really strong. This is why he was looking for a prophet. The prophecy is not a unique biblical phenomenon. In fact, it was discovered in Mesopotamia in the palace of Mari. There were many clay tablets with records of different prophecies. Particularly the prophets, they actually called themselves the prophets of different gods, and they spoke from the name of these gods to the king, and usually the king would have them on their staff. We have the examples of that in the later books of the Tanakh, particularly in the books of Kings, where Jezebel, for example, had the prophets of Baal that would tell her what to do. and then also the king of Israel had prophets. Particularly in 1 Kings chapter 22, we see how Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, and the king of Israel are making a decision whether or not they should attack Syria and take away the Ramoth Galaad or Gilad from it. And the king of Israel, the Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, said, we need to ask God about it. And the king of Israel calls a number of prophets that reassure the necessity of attacking. And of course, Jehoshaphat is a little bit hesitant about this. He said, is there any other opinion? And he said, the king of Israel said, yeah, there is another prophet, but I don't like him because he always tells something which I don't like. This is the key for it. The prophets were on the staff of the king, and their goal was to create a poetic oracles that would reassure the king, and also use some spells to attract the gods, particularly their respected gods, to help the king to do what is planned to be done. And that's why, with that in mind, Balak is looking for somebody who knows how to press the buttons of God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This mentality is really a Babylonian mentality. Because in Babylon, all gods, they use spells. Why would God need to use spells if He's omnipotent? The idea is very simple behind it. Gods are not omnipotent. All of this Ashur, Enlil, all of these gods, they're not omnipotent. But they know how to manipulate the higher world of magics. By the way, this philosophy didn't go away. The recent serials like Charmed or these children ones, Harry Potter, they illustrate that this understanding is well alive, that there is something very amorphous above which can be manipulated by someone who knows how to press the button. Well, this is why God acts the way He acts. When Balaam, who happened to be a prophet, in fact, communicated with God. The Balaam is not a unique figure. It is just an illustration that God had His people all around the world. Jethro was another example, the priest of God from the Midian. So Balaam was a prophet. He had a relation with God. God talked to him. But Balaam fell into the trap. Of course, he was well paid by Balak. And being a prophet of God, he probably seen other prophets who are well paid, and nobody really was interested in him. This is why he bit the bait and started on his journey from Mesopotamia all across the desert into the fields of Moab. And of course, during this story, God was trying to tell him something. Particularly, all these stories about the talking donkey and all this resistance shows that there is a different approach. God is teaching Balaam that he is not like the ordinary prophet. He just won't be able to do what he is asked to because God is the one who controls the prophet, not the prophet who pushes God's buttons. And that's exactly what happens. When they arrive on the plateau and Balaam goes up the hill to see the Israelites, to see their camp, and he opens his mouth to curse them, out of his mouth comes the word, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkanotecha Yisrael. How good are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. And he made several attempts to curse, but he was under control of God, and there is nothing he could do. This was a great manifestation of God's power, because Balak, the king of Moab, could see clearly that God of Israel, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, cannot be manipulated. And that's why he feared even more. But Balaam has suggested to Balak a much better solution, because he knew the blind spots of the people of Israel. He knew that whenever it is impossible to attack the people of God from outside, it's very easy to corrupt them from inside. And this is exactly what happened. While Israel remained at Shittim, it's Numbers chapter 25, verse 1. The people began to play the harlot with the daughters of Moab. For they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. This is the illustration how breaking one commandment, the commandment number 7, leads to the breaking of the entire law. And in particular, the context of the harlotry here in the ancient Near East, where it is not just a satisfaction of someone's sexual hunger. It is always connected with idolatry. And this is what happens. Israel had been at this camp for quite a while. They were right at the Moab's border. And this nice women who were a priestess in the Moabite temples, they came in. As it was discussed in a previous Torah portion, Moab was the source of the cult of fertility and the cult of Moloch. And that's why Israel was warned about particularly Moloch, which was the Moabite deity. Baal Peor was one of the Moabites' deities too, responsible for fertility. And that's why God was very diligent in warning Israelites to avoid any contact, but the advice wasn't taken. They fell into temptation and they started worshiping the idols. And so it says here in verse 3, Israel joined themselves to Baal Peor, and the Lord was angry against Israel. And so Lord commands to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. This seems to be like a terrible command. How can a loving God allow or command Moses to do such a cruelty, especially in the light of the intense discussion about the death penalty today? This seems to be really, really supportive to the Marcion's ideas. Well, first of all, let's look how this order from God was executed. Verse 5, Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you slay his men who have joined themselves to Baal Peor. This is how Moses executes the order. It wasn't like he created a band and they just walked around the camp and started hanging people. By the way, this is why the God is enraged, because he says, take the leaders. Because the leaders, the government, some people in the government, those who were placed since the time of Jethro, over 1,000 and over 10,000, they were involved. And of course, that created even a stronger problem here. And this is why Moses uses existing court system. It wasn't some kind of a lynch mob. He commanded the judges who were responsible for their part, for their tribes or the parts of the tribes. He said, you see these crimes, you see this happening, go and take care of it according to the law. And the law was clear. The Parashat Shoftim, the judgments, was given to the people of Israel 40 years ago. And again, we see two things. Number one, never should we generalize by saying Israel joined themselves to Baal Peor. We can never make or draw any conclusion that every single man in Israel was breaking the commandment. We see that there were a number of the leaders who were involved in this, and they were showing bad examples, and it could really go out of control. That's why the Lord said to Moses, you have a legal system, you have judicial power, you have justice, get it to work and take care of the problem. Like any country does. When the crime goes out of control, in order to prevent it, the country has a law enforcement system that will work. If the law enforcement system doesn't work, this will show the example to others who doubt, and they will start making a crime. So the system here, in fact, works. The leaders, the judges took care of those leaders and executed them following the procedures, the judicial procedures. And then in the middle of that, this is what happens. And behold, one of the sons of Israel came and brought to his relatives a Midianite woman in sight of Moses, and in the sight of all congregation of the sons of Israel, while they were weeping at the door of the tent of meetings. What was happening at the door of the tent of meetings? We know, according to the book of Leviticus chapter 4, if the congregation sins and breaks the commandment, the high priest has to do a special sin offering. It was a service of repentance. They were supposed to slaughter the bull. And the high priest was not allowed, of course, to eat that bull, but he was supposed to take the blood of that bull and put that blood on the veil. And so all assembly now of Israel is standing in awe in front of the sanctuary, is praying for forgiveness, is in a state of repentance, which actually shows that the judicial system worked and it exactly did what it's supposed to do, to call people to order in their minds and in their hearts. And in the midst of all of it, with no consideration, no regard, that man brings a Midianite woman. Well, the verse 14 actually explains what happens. Now the name of the slain man of Israel who was slain with Midianite woman was Zimri, the son of Salu, a leader of a father's household among the Simeonites. So this man was the leader, was the part of the government of the tribe of Shimon. And he thinks that he can get away with the stuff. He thinks that he is immune from the prosecution, and he takes the Midianite woman right into his tent in the sight of everybody. What is everyone supposed to do? The service is going on. People are in reverence to God. And something happened right there. This is an affront attack on God's authority. The attack which would, if it is carried and neglected, would have a tragic consequences for people. And that's why Pinchas, in his zeal, sees it. He raises from the midst of the congregation. He takes the spear in his hand, and he goes after a man of Israel into the tent and pierces both of them through, man of Israel and a woman, through the body. I think that description is very clear what they were doing. If through one pierce of the spear he killed both man and a woman. Of course, there is a problem with judicial procedure. He is only one witness of the crime, and plus, as we see, he is not authorized to carry out what he did without the court procedure. But he does it because what has just happened goes out of any possible lines of any possible behavior. This really is, this Simeonite leader really is an illustration of what the high-handed sin could be. And that's why God reacts clearly. And in the midst of this service, he says, all right, I'm going to give to the Pinchas the covenant of peace. Because now Pinchas looks like he committed a crime. And plus, he committed a crime with intention. Yeah, because if somebody intentionally kills, he's supposed to be executed. And God said, oh, this doesn't work here. Even though he did what he did, I give him my protection, my covenant of peace. I give him my immunity from persecution. The Haftarah to this Torah portion is found in the book of Kings, chapter 19 and 20. We have a similar situation where God has allowed Elijah to execute the prophets of Baal. And again, these prophets of Baal, 400 of them, were executed right away, right there, after the Mount Carmel. And it was executed, they were executed by the crowd of people of Israel who saw the differences between the Baal and God, when God has consumed the sacrifice on the altar which Elijah built, and the water was all over it. These prophets of Baal were responsible for deceiving people for many, many years. That's why everybody was so angry. And plus, we're dealing with the kingdom of Ahab, which doesn't follow the Torah and just doesn't have any judicial system according to the Torah. And Elijah now seems to think that he is gaining some victory, but there is no victory. Jezebel is looking to kill him. And he runs to the Mount Sinai, or Horeb, and he meets with God. And he says, there is no hope for Israel. There is absolutely no hope. I did what you told me to do, and now they're looking for my life. But God said to Elijah, 1 Kings 19:18, yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. The same way as in Israel, not everyone went after Baal Peor. Here, not everyone went after the Baal. In the same way, we recommend to read Revelation chapter 12 about the people of God, the remnant of the seed of the woman, whom Satan hates with passion. And it says in verse 17 that the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with her, with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus.